So I was just finishing up tonight's video when I just happened to see the exchange between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office, and I just felt that this was something that was too important not to comment on. I think what we have just seen truly is one of the most appalling scenes I think I've ever seen in international diplomacy. It really was truly shocking. I don't know how many of you will have seen it. I should imagine that most of you have already seen it, but the way that that played out, and I at first saw the snippet where Trump was talking to Zelensky and the tone was very bad, and my immediate thought was, how did it really get to that? What led up to it? And it was really quite incredible that the way that Vance had stepped in to really orchestrate all of this. And I think I had several thoughts that came out of it, because, I mean, one could say that this was a very bad-tempered exchange. Yes, we know that. But I think what really is important here is the underlying thinking that goes behind it. That I think, yes, tempers could get frayed. We know how Trump behaves. Zelensky is obviously somebody who has been under a lot of stress for 3 years, and I'm not actually condemning what he said. I think a lot of people will feel that it was admirable that he stood up and made some clarifications, and Vance really, I think, goaded him into this. And what I think really stands out in all of this just wasn't a case of things exploding. I think that anyone with any ounce of either empathy for Zelensky's position or fundamentally any sort of support for where Ukraine is would not have done that. I think this was the absolute clearest possible sign. And we had it in our mind, what is Trump up to here? There's been a lot of rumors that, he's pro-Putin, he's pro-Russian, but, a lot of people were saying, well, no, maybe that wasn't what was going on, that he was trying to get a good deal for America. This is absolutely, you would not have done that if you had any sort of sympathy, an ounce of sympathy for the position that Ukraine finds itself in. That is just not the sort of thing that you would have said. And it was very, very clear that Vance had absolutely no thought at all of how he would respond if it had happened to the United States, the sort of pressure that Zelensky is under. And so I think that, this really is in many ways, I mean, we keep talking about turning points in international relations and what we're seeing at the moment and all the things that we've seen been playing out over this past month. But I think that for many viewers, this will be the low point for where we are now. And I have to say, and I mean, I think, we can be very sometimes prone to hyperbole in when we sort of talk about what's going on in the news. But I have to say that, like many others, I actually felt sick watching that. I mean, it was truly, truly appalling. And it was absolutely unprecedented behavior, and to see that playing out. And I can only wonder now, what is going to be the wider reaction to this? How are European leaders going to respond to it? But in many ways, my bigger interest is how is this going to play out amongst congressional Republicans who, even if publicly they were lining up now to support, they have been lining up to support Trump and or trying at least not to create waves, how they can possibly respond to something like this. Because, as I say, this is not just Trump sort of being angry at Zelensky. This fundamentally betrays the fact that the US leadership under Trump and Vance have absolutely no time for Ukraine. They have no intention whatsoever of supporting Ukraine. And I think this is going to play out in all sorts of ways. One of the things I think I'm really interested in as an immediate reaction to all of this is where Marco Rubio as Secretary of State lines up in all of this, because and I've been thinking a lot about this in the past few days. This is somebody who is quite clearly very, very unhappy at the sort of things that he's having to do. So in the 1 month since he's been appointed, and remembering that most people felt he was the most qualified and perhaps the only serious person that Trump appointed to his cabinet, how he feels having to turn his back on so many of his established positions. The fact that he had to oversee, the closure of USAID, the fact that he's had to go and open up talks with Russia, which essentially was about restarting trade relations while there still hasn't been any sort of conclusion to the war in Ukraine, that, he's had to stand up for Trump's threats against NATO partners, against neighbors such as Mexico and Panama. All of these things, one can only wonder how much longer he can really remain in post and maintain any sort of integrity and self-respect, because really everything that we're seeing runs against the sort of things that he stands for. But I think we can say the same for many, many other Republicans. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, because I think that, has this finally crossed the line where people will now have to actually sort of say, look, we can't take this position that Trump is now speaking in ways that one can only say are parroting Kremlin positions. I mean, it's as simple as that, talking about World War III and how Ukraine is. No mention, of course, that, the person who actually is toying with World War III was Vladimir Putin by invading a sovereign country. So I think, this is a really, really important moment in that sense, but also what is going to be the sort of response that we're going to see from European countries from all of this. In many ways, we had a fascinating week. Both Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer as the French president and British prime minister, I think by all accounts, however one feels about it, about Trump, played it extremely well. But what we've just seen with Zelensky offers a very different view on this. As I say, you could come in it and say, well, they played it really cool. They did it just right. Zelensky didn't. But when you look back at how that escalated, you could see that in many ways that Vance was actually out to get Zelensky. And Zelensky, yes, maybe could have cooled it down a bit, but it was very, very clear that they weren't sympathetic to him at all. In fact, they were absolutely hostile. You can see that very clearly now. So how do we now look at the fact, how do Macron and Starmer deal with this? How do all Europeans deal with this? Because it's very clear that Trump is, can we really consider foreign policy being done on the basis that you have to constantly and forever be tiptoeing around Trump because of he might explode, and, that everyone is constantly having to play nice to him because they're just worried about him blowing up. But the reality is that that's going to happen anyway, that unless he gets absolutely what he wants. So in many ways, I think many people will be looking back at this and saying Macron and Starmer had done really well. But now looking at how Zelensky was treated and what has happened, were they too accommodating? For Britain, I think it's going to be in a very difficult position because, of course, the UK is caught in a bind post-Brexit. It doesn't want to be caught up with Trump's tariffs on the European Union, and so is desperately sort of trying to keep out of this. But on the other hand, I think that this is a moment when the UK is really going to be caught in a very, very difficult bind. That behaviour that we saw this evening, I think there's going to be a very big backlash in the UK as well about how Britain deals with Trump. And I think that, I look, for anyone who follows the channels knows that I have always been very opposed to Brexit, and I think that break with Europe was disastrous. I think it was disastrous in economic terms. I think what we're now seeing is it was disastrous in strategic and military terms, and that this, I think, will drive that impetus for a closer relationship between Britain and Europe. But I think for many European leaders, they will have watched that and be utterly appalled. And I think that many allies of the United States will also be feeling the same way. So I immediately sort of just went and had a look at what some of the social media was saying. And it was very interesting that, there is a view that, this has highlighted, can any NATO state, any NATO member feel confident that if something happens to them, that Trump, as US president, will align the United States behind them? So in many ways, this has fundamentally undermined Article 5 of the NATO treaty, with all the implications that has. So look, I just felt that this was something I needed to say, having watched that, that I think I can only describe it as shameful. I said that I don't want the channel to be all Trump all the time, that I would only cover what I think are major developments, and there just seem to be too many of them, but where I could put it in a broader context of what was going on. So, for example, about USAID was a good opportunity to look at the history of international aid and why it's important. The threats against Mexico and Canada were a really good opportunity to look at trade. But this is just one of those moments when, yes, there are broader lessons to be learnt, but just from a fundamental diplomatic point of view, and for what this means for Western unity and for the Western alliance, and what this means for international politics as a whole. Unfortunately, this was just one of those moments that just simply couldn't go unremarked on. So I'm sorry, the video I was going to put up tonight, I will hold off and maybe put up on Tuesday, but I just felt that this was too important to miss. And please do let me know in the comments below how you feel about all of this. I will put a link to the footage in case anyone hasn't seen it. But where do you think this goes? What do you think this means for Trump? What do you think this will mean for US foreign policy? Will Republicans now start to speak out against this? What is the position of someone like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, who's clearly having to defend what is increasingly becoming the indefensible? And what will Britain and European countries do? And do you think other countries can really trust the United States? I should imagine that Taiwan is watching this very, very nervously at the moment. So anyway, look, thanks for bearing with me on this. And please, as I say, I'd be really, really interested to hear what you make of all of this, because as I say, to my mind, I don't think I've ever seen such a display, certainly not from a US president or a major Western leader. It really, really defies belief.